It is the early hours of June 6th, 1944, somewhere in the English Channel off the coast of Calais, and a German radar operator is watching something impossible take shape on his screen. A vast fleet, dozens of vessels strong, is grinding steadily towards the French coast at a lorry's walking pace. He telephones his superiors. Reinforcements are put on alert. Coastal batteries swing their barrels towards the water. And yet, when dawn breaks, no ships arrive. No troops storm the beaches, because there were no ships. There was only a fleet of small boats towing metal reflectors called moonshine, aircraft dropping strips of foil known as window, and 16 naval launches broadcasting the recorded engine noise of an invasion armada across 60 kilometers of open sea. 80 kilometers to the west, on the beaches of Normandy, the real invasion was underway. And for reasons that would take historians decades to fully piece together, an entire German army, built around some of the most formidable armored divisions in the Wehrmacht, would spend the following 7 weeks waiting for a second landing that was never going to come. This is the story of how Britain's deception planners did not simply mislead the German High Command. They invented an army that did not exist, gave it a commander, a wireless network, a physical presence of inflatable tanks and plywood landing craft, and then used it to pin down formations that Field Marshal Erwin Rommel desperately needed on the Normandy coast. It is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most successful confidence tricks in military history. To understand why this deception was necessary, you have to understand the arithmetic that haunted Allied planners in the winter of 1943 and spring of 1944. Germany had spent 4 years fortifying the coastline of occupied Europe. The Atlantic Wall, as Hitler's propagandists called it, ran from Norway to the Spanish border, a chain of bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, and beach obstacles that on paper looked unbreakable. Behind that wall sat roughly 60 German divisions, and critically, 10 of them were Panzer or Panzer Grenadier divisions, formations built around tanks and mechanized infantry that could move fast enough to throw an amphibious landing back into the sea before it had a chance to establish itself. The Allied planners running Operation Overlord knew a brutal truth. Their forces would be desperately vulnerable in the first 72 hours. A beachhead is not a fortress. It is thousands of exhausted men on open sand with limited artillery, no armor to speak of beyond what could be floated ashore, and a supply line that ran back across 130 kilometers of open water. If the Germans identified Normandy as the landing site quickly and concentrated even 3 or 4 Panzer divisions against it within the first 2 days, the invasion could fail outright. Dieppe in 1942 had already demonstrated at appalling cost what happened when an amphibious assault met a defense that knew roughly where and when it was coming. The geography made the problem worse. Pas-de-Calais offered the shortest crossing from England, the most direct route into Germany's industrial heartland, and terrain the German staff considered the obvious choice for any invasion. Normandy, by contrast, was further away, protected by a difficult tidal system and seemingly less logical as a target. Allied planners could not simply hope the Germans guessed wrong. They needed to make the Germans believe with real conviction that the main blow would fall at Calais, and that whatever happened in Normandy was a diversion designed to draw German reserves away from the true invasion point. That meant convincing Hitler's intelligence services that an entire additional army existed, ready to strike Calais weeks after the real landings began, so that German commanders would keep their Panzer divisions in reserve rather than rushing them to Normandy. Failed to achieve this, and the invasion of Europe risked becoming the single bloodiest failure in modern military history. Previous attempts at strategic deception by Britain and by other combatants had rarely operated at the scale this problem demanded. Camouflage as a discipline was well understood by 1944, and small-scale ruses, false orders planted for the enemy to find, decoy airfields, dummy gun positions had all been tried with modest success earlier in the war, including in North Africa under Dudley Clark's pioneering deception unit, a force. But none of those earlier efforts had attempted to sustain a fiction on the scale of an entire army group across multiple intelligence disciplines simultaneously for a period of months against an enemy who would have every incentive to test and probe that fiction once the real invasion began. A single convincing dummy tank photographed by a reconnaissance pilot might buy a few days of confusion. What the planners needed was something that would survive weeks of German scrutiny after Allied troops were already fighting and dying on the beaches, when German intelligence had every reason to interrogate every scrap of information for the truth. That requirement, sustaining a lie under maximum pressure rather than simply planting one and hoping, was what made the challenge facing the London controlling section feel, to those working on it, close to impossible. The organization tasked with solving this problem was the London controlling section, working alongside the double-cross apparatus run by MI5 and a specialist unit named the 21st Army Group's Deception Staff under Colonel David Strangeways. Their creation became known as Operation Fortitude, itself part of the broader deception plan, codenamed Bodyguard, a name Churchill himself suggested, borrowing from his own remark that in wartime, truth is so precious, it must be attended by a bodyguard of lies. Fortitude split into two halves. Fortitude North suggested a fictional threat to Norway. Fortitude South, the more elaborate and consequential deception, invented an entire phantom army group aimed squarely at Calais. That phantom formation was called the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG for short, and it was placed, on paper, under the command of General George Patton, a man the Germans respected and feared more than almost any other Allied general. FUSAG existed almost nowhere except in radio transmissions, forged documents, and a landscape of deliberately visible fakery scattered across Kent and East Anglia, the counties of England directly opposite Calais. Real engineering units built dummy landing craft from scaffolding and canvas, floating structures that, from a reconnaissance aircraft, at 3,000 meters, looked identical to genuine tank-carrying vessels. Inflatable rubber tanks, weighing perhaps 90 kilograms each, and small enough for 4 soldiers to carry and erect in under an hour, were arranged in dispersed field parks, exactly as doctrine dictated real armor should be parked, complete with tire tracks plowed into the mud by ordinary lorries, to make the illusion convincing from above. Dummy aircraft, wood and canvas ammunition dumps, and fake fuel depots completed the picture. Camouflage netting was applied loosely and imperfectly, in a deliberate echo of how tired real soldiers actually camouflaged equipment, because netting that looked too neat was itself a giveaway to a trained aerial observer. The engineering behind the dummy landing craft alone deserves attention because it illustrates how seriously the deception planners treated the problem of aerial reconnaissance. German photographic interpreters were highly skilled, trained to spot the telltale shadows and proportions of genuine military hardware from thousands of meters up. A convincing decoy therefore had to replicate not just the outline of a landing craft, but its shadow, its buoyancy in the water, and its behavior in a tidal estuary. British engineers solved this with a design known as big bobs and wet bobs, floating scaffolding frameworks clad in canvas and painted to mimic the silhouette of genuine tank landing craft. Moored in the estuaries of Kent in numbers large enough to photograph convincingly from altitude, while requiring only a skeleton crew to maintain. The inflatable tanks, built primarily from rubber sheeting stretched over an internal frame, could be inflated using a simple air pump in a matter of minutes, and were deliberately weathered and imperfectly parked to avoid the suspiciously tidy appearance that might alert a skeptical interpreter. Entire dummy camps were built with real cooking fires lit at appropriate hours, real washing hung out on lines, and genuine radio operators cycling between locations to avoid the kind of static, unchanging signal pattern that German direction-finding equipment might flag as artificial. The physical decoys, however, were only the visible skin of a far deeper deception, and this is where the operation becomes genuinely remarkable. Wireless deception units, using genuine radio operators trained to replicate the traffic patterns of real divisions, filled the airwaves with the routine chatter of an army preparing to embark. Complaints about supplies, training schedules, administrative orders, all of it monitored by German signals intelligence and cross-referenced against a picture of Allied order of battle that German analysts believed was accurate. Layered on top of this was arguably the most audacious part of the whole scheme, the double-cross system, in which British intelligence had captured every German agent operating in Britain and turned the great majority of them into double agents, feeding carefully constructed lies back to their Abwehr handlers. The most valuable of these was a Spanish double agent codenamed Garbo, whose network of entirely fictional sub-agents, invented by Garbo and his British handler Thomas Harris, had spent 2 years building extraordinary credibility with German intelligence. In the days after the real Normandy landings, it was a message from Garbo, sent with impeccable timing after the invasion had already begun, that argued Normandy was a feint, and the true assault from Fusag was still to come. German intelligence trusted him so completely that he would later be awarded the Iron Cross by a Germany that had no idea it had been comprehensively deceived, while simultaneously receiving an MBE from the grateful British. The operational results of this deception are, unusually for intelligence history, reasonably well documented, because they can be measured in the movement or lack of movement of German divisions. In the immediate aftermath of D-Day, the German 15th Army, stationed in the Pas-de-Calais region and including several powerful panzer and infantry formations, remained largely in place rather than reinforcing Normandy. Hitler himself, briefed on the supposed Fusag threat, personally intervened to keep reserves near Calais rather than release them southward, a decision German field commanders on the ground in Normandy, increasingly desperate for reinforcement, found bewildering and frustrating. Estimates drawn from post-war analysis of German records suggest that as many as 19 German divisions, a substantial fraction of them armored, remained tied down away from the Normandy front through most of June and into July, weeks during which the Allied beachhead was at its most fragile. Exact figures remain debated among historians, since disentangling Fortitude's specific effect from the general fog of German command confusion is not straightforward, but the broad picture of a phantom army holding real Panzer divisions in place through sheer force of persuasion is not seriously disputed. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It is worth setting this achievement against what Germany itself attempted in the field of deception, because the contrast is instructive. German intelligence did run its own deceptions during the war, including efforts to disguise troop concentrations before the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, using radio silence and night movement rather than elaborate fakery. But Germany never built anything approaching the scale, patience, or interlocking sophistication of Fortitude South. Part of the reason was structural. The Abwehr and the rival SD intelligence service distrusted one another and competed for resources, weakening coordinated deception planning, and Germany's occupation of Britain never materialized, denying it the deep agent networks needed to feed convincing false intelligence back to London the way Britain fed it to Berlin. The Americans, for their part, ran deception operations of real skill later in the war, including the Ghost Army unit that used inflatable equipment and sound trucks in France and Germany during 1944 and 1945, a concept directly inspired by British methods and staffed partly through liaison with British deception veterans. But Fortitude South predates and outscales it, both in the size of the fictional force conjured and in the strategic stakes riding on its success. No other Allied deception of the war held responsibility for the outcome of a single operation as consequential as the Normandy landings themselves. It is also worth noting how differently the Soviet Union approached deception on the Eastern Front, since the comparison sharpens what made the British effort distinctive. Soviet maskirovka techniques, used extensively to disguise the concentration of forces before major offensives such as the encirclement at Stalingrad, relied heavily on physical concealment, camouflage, and misleading troop movements, rather than the layered combination of double agents, radio deception, and fabricated order of battle that defined Fortitude. The Soviet approach was often devastatingly effective at the operational level, but it rarely attempted to construct an entirely fictional strategic formation and sustain belief in it for months at a time. Fortitude's distinguishing achievement was less the individual technique, since dummy tanks and false radio traffic had all been used before in one form or another, than the orchestration of every available intelligence channel towards a single, coherent, and endlessly reinforced lie. The legacy of Fortitude reached well beyond the summer of 1944. It fundamentally reshaped how Western military and intelligence services thought about deception, feeding directly into Cold War doctrines of denial and misdirection practiced by both NATO and Warsaw Pact planners for decades afterwards. The double-cross system's demonstration that a hostile intelligence network could be entirely turned and weaponized against its own masters became a foundational case study taught in intelligence services around the world. Some of the physical deception, the inflatable tanks, and dummy landing craft can still be seen today in museum collections, including examples held by the Imperial War Museum, tangible relics of an army that was never anything more than rubber, plywood, and expertly targeted lies. What cannot be so easily measured is the counterfactual, the version of D-Day in which the German 15th Army arrived at Normandy in force within the first week. Historians are understandably cautious about declaring that fortitude alone won the battle for the beachhead, since Allied air superiority, naval gunfire, and the sheer courage of the men who landed all mattered enormously. But few dispute that without the phantom threat of Fusag hanging over Calais, the Normandy campaign would have been a far closer and bloodier contest, and quite possibly a failed one. Return for a moment to that German radar operator on the night of June 5th, 1944, watching an invasion fleet that did not exist crawl towards a beach that was never going to be attacked. He was not a fool. He was an experienced professional, reading data that had been meticulously engineered to deceive him, by planners who understood that the most dangerous weapon in the Allied arsenal that summer was not a tank or a battleship, but an idea, patiently constructed and relentlessly reinforced, that an army stood ready in Kent under a general the Germans feared above all others. That idea held. It held through the anxious days after the real landings, when German commanders begged Berlin for the reserves that never came. It held because a network of double agents, a scattering of rubber tanks, and a storm of false radio traffic had achieved something that no amount of steel alone could guarantee: the paralysis of an enemy who could not bring himself to believe his own eyes were being lied to. 19 divisions did not fire a shot in anger during the most critical weeks of the Normandy campaign, held in place by a phantom. That is the strange, almost unbelievable truth at the heart of Operation Fortitude. Britain did not simply outfight the German army at Calais. It defeated an army that was never there to begin with, by building one that was never there either, and somehow making both sides believe in it completely. In a war remembered largely for its machinery, its bombers and battleships and tanks, it was an act of pure imagination, executed with engineering precision, that may have done more to open the door into occupied Europe than any single weapon fired that summer. Consider what was actually assembled to achieve this. No factory in Britain produced a single additional tank, aircraft, or landing craft for Fusag, because Fusag needed none of those things to be real. It needed only to be believed. A handful of rubber sheets, a scattering of scaffolding and canvas, a disciplined rota of wireless operators typing out the mundane traffic of an army that did not exist, and the extraordinary patience of double agents who had spent years cultivating trust with their German handlers for exactly this moment. These were the raw materials of the deception, weighed against the German reserves it held in place, against the Panzer divisions that might otherwise have reached the Normandy beachhead while it was still at its most fragile. The disproportion between effort and effect is almost startling. It is the clearest possible illustration of a principle that runs through the entire history of British deception operations in the Second World War. That in modern warfare, controlling what the enemy believes can matter every bit as much as controlling what he can see through a gun sight. The German officers who kept the 15th Army waiting at Calais through the summer of 1944 were experienced, professional, and far from careless. They were simply on the losing end of a lie so carefully constructed, so patiently maintained, and so relentlessly cross-referenced across every channel of intelligence available to them, that disbelieving it would have required them to distrust their own most reliable sources of information. That is the genius of Operation Fortitude. And it is why, more than 80 years on, an army built from rubber, scaffolding, and expertly targeted falsehood still deserves to be remembered as one of the decisive contributions to the liberation of Europe.